Hi everyone, it's Summer with AstariaSen, and I talk a lot about fairies, elves, fae creatures, tarot cards, altars, pagan related stuff. So if you're interested in that, please hit the subscribe button, and we are going to get on with a book review. The Lore of Old Elfland by Miss Linda Raedisch. Isn't that cover phenomenal? Now this book isn't very big. It didn't take me very long to read, but it's folk tales, stories, recipes, and crafts from the lands of elves and fairies. I was both surprised and a little put off by this book, mainly because I didn't expect there to be so much technical history. Now, don't get me wrong, this book isn't necessarily a historical book. It's basically it's like Linda's journey into finding out about elves in a way. She states in here that she doesn't necessarily believe in elves, but believes that that belief in elves should be there. And she doesn't also talk about all fae in general, but she does equate elves and fairies as pretty much the same creatures. I don't, so I disagree with that. I think that elves and fairies are separate under a more generic term of fae creatures. So anyways, I have lots of stuff marked here that I wanted to go over with you. One thing I did find interesting that she talks about the fairies with is where the name fairy actually come from. And I might be butchering the actual pronunciations of this, so sorry. Anyways, it comes from fatum, which also means fate, which also goes into the fates of Clotho, Lachius, and Atropos in Greek. I think that's how you pronounce those names. If not, so sorry for butchering that. Anyways, but then she goes on to talk about how fatum actually is Latin, but there's a word, fari. I think that's how you say it. F with a that has a little like line on top of it, R, and then I. I think that's how you spell it, is fari, and it actually means to speak. And that actually sounds more like fairy than the fatum or fatum or however. But it was, that word was Indo-European. And let's see, it was a Bronze Age kind of word. She talks a lot about the Bronze Age in this book, like a ton. And she talks about how Peri is also very similar to fairy, and it's the Persian form of basically the same thing, which means like ethereal beauty or something like that. I kind of like Peri though, that's pretty cute. Anyway, so then she also talks about how she's not instructing people in this book to go soliciting the elves or go do stuff with the elves or anything like that. She's basically talking about the crafts and recipes and folklore that she found on her journey, pretty much, as she's been through a bunch of things like in Germany and all over the place, including Scotland and Ireland and Iceland and all that stuff. So, I mean, she's really been a lot of places. She knows her material very well. She also talks a lot about Tolkien. I think that's how you pronounce it, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Middle Earth and stuff like that. She equates folklore and Tolkien together a lot. And then she has something interesting that brides were sometimes abducted, like right before their weddings. And one of the things in here is that a bride to be, basically, like, it's not necessarily, she's a bride, so she isn't actually married, but she's technically no longer single. So she's in this in-between stage, and there's a story in here about brides being abducted and goes into the folklore of that. And she actually states, and I love this because the in-between is very fae. It's a very fae thing. But she talks about how brides are vulnerable because they're in that in-between stage, which like childhood and wife or wedded bliss and stuff like that, they're neither here nor there. They're in a literal like in-between segment of life. And so they can more easily be taken or be coaxed. And then she talks about, I really do love this book. Like there's so much material in it that I do resonate with. And I read it really quickly. I like consumed it, but she does do like crafting, actual crafting, like crafts that you make. And she talks about like elf stones and stuff like that and how you can make them. But then one thing that she comments on that I found really interesting, because she talks about dwarves too and like trolls and a little bit about witches, not super lot. But the idea is that Elfland encompasses all this folklore of elves and witches and mound people and hidden people and trolls and dwarves and all this stuff. And that's also why she equates it to Middle Earth and Tolkien. Anyways, she talks about how the dwarves are famous for popping in and out of stones, sometimes even leading the hero through the glittering halls within the stone. How neat is that? That is so cool. And it's on page 45 of this book, and it's amazing. Let's see. Like she has a lot of crafts in here. Like this is the footprint stones that she's got as a craft in here. A sun wheel. I mean, it's rhetoric. It's not like super elaborate or anything. It doesn't mean you couldn't make yours elaborate, but it's based off Bronze Age stylistic stuff, which wasn't like super, super technical, I guess. I mean, they were, but they weren't. Anyways, so then she goes into a lot of different folklore. She has so much folklore in this book. Little stories about changelings, a little bit about brides, about dwarves, about elves, and like the different areas, how similar some of the folklore is, even though it doesn't mention the exact same things and it doesn't end the exact same way, which is super fascinating to me, by the way. Then she talks about like she's got more craft stuff in here, like all sorts of craft stuff that I plan on trying. But she talks about it's like a time. Okay, like there's an elf cross that you can make in this book, which I plan on doing. I'll show you what it looks like. Give me just a second here. It's very pretty, actually. This is the elf cross right here. It's very pretty. I do want to make one. I do really, really, really want to make one. But it talks about how you forge magical objects and how there's a certain procedure for forging magical objects. And like back in the Bronze Age, if you wanted an elf cross, like for protection, then you would take silver from certain areas, certain people. You would ask for the silver, and then you would take it to the blacksmith and you would put it under a tablecloth, and it was a common exchange. Like you didn't say anything about it, but you would talk to the blacksmith or metal worker about their farmstead, about their home life, about stuff going on in their area, in their world, in their life, in their family, and all that stuff. And basically it was an exchange that was mutual, that if you put the silver underneath there and they told you something that was essential in their home life that was needed or something like that, you would, in exchange for them making you an elf cross, because it was just common that if you put the silver under the tablecloth, they would make you an elf cross because it wasn't something you did out in the open, but you would bring them something that was essential to their home. So if they said they were out of, grain material or something like that, then you would bring grain material and stick it under the tablecloth and then exchange it for your elf cross. So that's really, really cool. And that it was technically done in a certain amount of Thursdays, which is fascinating to me. She says in here, the exact procedure varied from province to province, but when a certain number of Thursdays had passed, You returned to the smith's house bearing a gift of whatever you thought was most needed on the farmstead. The earlier ritual was reenacted after you found your finished elf cross waiting for you under the tablecloth. And the earlier ritual, what she's talking about is the chit-chat, basically, like asking about your home life and stuff like that. But it talks about how to make the elf cross in here. Then the next thing I found really interesting is spoons, silver spoons. She talks about a lot of folklore and traditions or superstitions. I don't even know if it's superstitions necessarily, but like traditions of dropping silver spoons, and how elves in a lot of the folklore tales would drop spoons in exchange for doing things or for having something done for them, which was really interesting. So it was a payment for goods or services basically rendered. She talks about a folk tale called The Midwives and the Fairies, and in payment for delivering the midwife's baby, she drops a silver spoon for the fairies and stuff like that. So I find that really interesting. Like this is the kind of stuff I don't get in Wyoming. So it is very it's something that I didn't know before, something that I crave more knowledge on. And then back here in the book, she goes into actual recipes. There are recipes throughout the book as well, just like it says on the backs, crafts and recipes and folk tales. A lot of folk tales are in this book. Most of this is about the Bronze Age. But it's a recipe for cookies. Yeah, I'm so excited about the cookies. And it really seems simple. I mean, honestly, I can't make cookies very well, honestly. I can't bake to save my life, but I'm going to try it because I want to. And I'll let you guys know how it goes, I mean, ultimately. Then there's one for elderberry soup and farina dumplings, and it tells you how to make all of that, which I just love. And this is towards the end of the book. And then at the very end, like her conclusion, she tells you that she doesn't necessarily believe in elves, but that she believes that the belief in elves should be there, and that we should have somewhere we believe to go and stuff like that. But she talks about the elves being universal, and every culture has its own branch of elf kind. So I found that very fascinating. And then in the back, in the appendix, she has this whole section that tells you about Barrowfire, about the Drog, about the Black Elves, about the Dark Elves, about the Dees, about dwarfs, dwarf names, elf mounds, dwarven women, echoes, elf names, elf sicknesses, elf locks, ghosts, hidden folk, hillmen. There is so much in the back. The Norns, the trolls. I mean, there is a lot in this book that you could really take away from it, but it is filled with a lot of historical knowledge as well about the Bronze Age, as well as intermixing it with the Middle Earth of Tolkien, and talks about books about Middle Earth and elves and stuff like that. So it is interesting. It's only, what is it? It's only 183 pages long. It's pretty simple read. But it has a lot of information in it, so I should have actually like impacted it in a more took some more time in between the chapters and stuff, because there was a lot of information in the chapters, and it was all good information, a little more than I always want to know, especially when it comes to historical stuff. Like, I'm not a big history buff. So anyways, yeah, this was a good book. I recommend it if you are interested in elves and folk tales about elves and mound people and dwarves, and interested in some historical notes about Scandinavia, about German, about Iceland, about the Bronze Age and stuff like that. So if you're interested in any of those things, this book can really be something that's enlightening for you, and I will be keeping it on my shelf and referring back to it probably for months to come as I try out all these recipes and crafts that I want to do. So yeah, anyways, thank you so much for watching. I will leave the link down in the description about where you can buy this book online. And I hope you guys have a very terrific day.